Today at World Talks we'll be joined by Benedetta Berti. We'll discuss if democracy can bring change in a post-revolutionary society and what are the perceived threats as a result. Now, when you look at the Muslim world and you look at the proponents of change, you find there are those who are talking about change through participation in parliamentary democracy. There are those who are talking about raising awareness and bringing a bottom-up change. And then there are those groups that are talking about using force to bring change. Do you feel that the narrative of bringing change through parliamentary democracy is perhaps losing its strength, and those who are talking about the use of force are perhaps winning, at least, the arguments at the current during the current times, when they say that when you come into power through democracy, you can be overthrown, there can be military intervention or some sort of a capital flight, and it's not going to work? Do you feel this narrative from groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh is getting stronger?
Well, I certainly feel that the context does not help, in the sense that when you have a country like Syria that has been plagued by years and years of war, when you have Yemen, when you have Libya, when you have countries with conflict and instability, well, that situation gives, in a sense, an easier time, an opportunity to arm groups, including terrorist organizations, to exploit that gap and to have an easier time mobilizing and making their arguments. So I think the general context is not unhelpful, it's not very helpful. And I mean, you mentioned Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is, I think, a very good example of a group that looked at what was happening in the region and readjusted the strategy, focusing much more on local action, focusing much more on local alliances, becoming more interested in things like governance, which they didn't do before. And in doing so, they have become more of a, I don't want to say valid, I don't think they're a valid alternative, but they have managed to improve their branding. I think in the long run, and that's more than a political analysis, it's hope, I very much think that sustainable political change will happen much better when it happens through the democratic system, through the political system, in a gradual way, bringing people along. And I think there's a lot of academic research that actually tells us that revolutions can smash things, but they have a much harder time building afterwards.
Now, you said earlier that perhaps you're reluctant to use the term democracy promotion because it gives an impression that something is being imposed. Mm-hmm. But when we look at phraseology like enemies of freedom and so forth, does it not give the impression that it is a conflict between value systems? Mm-hmm. And doesn't it provide ammunition, again, to groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, who say that this is a us against them narrative? And
I think that's a valid point, and I think that's one of the issues that we really need to pay attention to. I think it's very, it's not just incorrect, but it's not helpful when we phrase this in a civilizational conflict type of terms, because, well, first of all, for empirical data, if you look at most of the victims of group like Daesh, well, those are the very same Muslims that live in Syria and Iraq and are the first victims. So more than a conflict between civilization, I will talk about a conflict between the forces that want to promote democracy, that believe in freedom, human rights, and that's really something that has nothing to do with one particular religion or nationality, and those that are trying to subvert the system through violence. So I think it's very helpful to actually avoid this type of terminology by trying to make this an us against them. It's not really like that.
Also, I think looking at evidence, it's probably fair to say that the majority of Muslims are opposed to groups like Daesh and so forth. But at the same time, what those Muslims feel is that when they come across reports from RAND Corporation and other Western think tanks, they feel that it's quite clear that there is opposition from the West to any sort of an Islamic order emerging, even in Muslim countries. In a situation like this, don't you feel that it's merely polarizing the situation, and those Muslims who are opposed to militant engagement are feeling marginalized?
Well, my response to that is that I think in many societies in the West, the debate is far less nuanced than that, and it really has been focused on the most militant and radical groups, much like Daesh, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion on everything else that is happening, and that is because the idea of potential ISIS cells in European societies, definitely making people very concerned. So in other words, the focus has been security and security only, for reasons that I entirely understand, and that has to some extent marginalized other parts of the debate. Perhaps in the future, as we move forward, we will be able to have a broader political debate about civilizations and political orders, but I don't think that's really what the debate has been about.